Welcome, everyone. So I am Tovim. Good afternoon. And I think our Vice President of Academic Affairs, namely Dr. Eric Kaplan, will formally greet you, and then we'll be doing a poem in honor of the fact that we're counting the Omer, and then we'll begin with the program. So thank you for being with us.
Yeah, so it's good to see everybody on the screen. Those of you who have your cameras on, and the others just to see names that I know and to meet people that I don't know. Some of you I know are kind of veterans of Kaplan Center activities, but just to remind you that we record all our webinars so that we can then post them on on the website. We tend to post the version that focuses on the speaker, not the one that focuses on the Hollywood Squares kind of situation. Um, but if you don't want to have the risk of showing up on this webinar video, then you should turn off your camera. And again, as all of you know, the Kaplan Center is devoted to kind of forwarding the key issues that were central to Mordechai Kaplan and to bringing his perspective on these issues into the public realm. We've been pretty active for going on some 14 years. Jane Susswine, who's traveling at the moment, is our board president. And Elisheva, as some of you know, is the director of the Kaplan Center at this time. Um, my role moving forward is going to be to give a brief discussion of some of the issues that we're going to be looking at, but that's not for a couple of minutes. But one of the key points, things that I will be doing is keeping an eye on the chat, and when the opportunity arises to bring your questions to the attention of Jeffrey. Um, Jeffrey Schein, who's the presenter, the core presenter today, should be pretty well known to all of us here on the call, in addition to being a previous director of the Kaplan Center himself. He's been with the Kaplan Center in some form, pretty close to from the start. First focusing on education and bringing Kaplanian perspectives on education. Um, into the Kaplan Center, which we weren't doing that much originally at the time. And as today's webinar is going to show, he's continuing to think a lot and creatively, as he always does, on Kaplan and Kaplanian education as we head into the 21st century. And today he's going to be thinking about some of these issues as it relates in part, to a work that Kaplan published originally in Hebrew in 1954, but that we're bringing shortly to all of you in a highly edited English version. But I'll have more to say about that later. So it's my pleasure to turn things over to Jeffrey.
So you will see in just a moment a reading about counting the journey from Pesach to Sinai. And we're sort of Bein Hashmashot. We're in the twinkling of an eye. Some of you are in the 10th day of counting the Omer. Some of you the 11th day, depending on your time zone. Still, we're counting. And this particular reading comes from Oneg Shabbat, a Sabbath evening table companion, recently published by the Kaplan Center. So, Sheridan, we thank you always for your help getting this together. And if you'll put the reading up, I believe a bot call will answer it and begin to share it with us.
Blessed mystery. In it for the long haul. We begin the count. We count centuries from Joseph to Miriam, count years from the burning bush to the song of the sea, count weeks from manna to Sinai, count days from the blare of God's horn to the golden calf, count the 5 books of Moses, count the 24 books of the Tanakh, count the 49 days of the Omer, count the 7 Sfirot, count and take us to Shavuot, and count the blintzes and the brekas. Maybe it's a myth, maybe it's current events, but Torah is only the beginning. We're in it for the long haul, and everyone has a sea of reeds to cross. Everyone has a story. Blessed, holy wholeness. Everyone counts.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And I would like to follow that up with a blessing. I'll say a word about it. If this is a blessing that is resonant for you, that captures your experience, you can drop into the chat box, Amen. So here we have the title for what we're exploring, The Echoing Voices of Sinai, Kaplan and Revelation. And I share with you a blessing I've come to be fond of as an alternative to the more usual La'asok b'divrei Torah. Of course, we're glad to be engaged with words of Torah always, but this blessing, which sometimes is called the Sinai blessing, captures the miracle from God's perspective and from a human perspective that there could be as many as 600,000 human beings, each of whom looks different from one another, each of whom thinks differently from one another, and yet they're capable of coming together, being brought together for a common purpose. I first began to use this a great deal during COVID because I thought we needed to be appreciative of the technology, the Zoom or whatever, that allowed us to come together. But in light of preparing for Sinai and Shavuot, I see this blessing a little differently. Still, I give you the invitation, if it says something important to you, to drop an amen into the chat room. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hacham harozim. Blessed is God who inspires us to bring together diverse minds and hearts into unified moral and spiritual purposes to which you might choose to say Amen. Okay, I want to say a word about the volume that has been knocking around in my mind for 12 years now and is beginning to crystallize, and I will begin to work in earnest on it this summer. It's a 21st century Kaplanian vision of educational growth. And there's 4 sections of it. There's foundations. What does it mean to have an educational vision that keeps you grounded and directs you to the future? There's a section that I call our high 18 best models of Kaplanian educational curricula that have been curated over the years by the Kaplan Center. I'm speaking later this week to folks from RENA and from Reconstructing Judaism about their adding some selections there too in an appendix that they would develop. And then there's how we think about what we do, lifelong learning tools. We have many of them. They'll be refined and made available. And then there's a last section. The name will probably change right now. I call it the Fugue, revisiting some key elements of Kaplan and other things that help the vision hold together. Today, I'm going to share with you only the first chapter, Dayenu, it's enough to talk about Revelation and the way it begins with young children. So from the beginning, Sinai, Kaplan, and educational growth, that's Revelation. And at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about redemption and one of the last chapters in the book where I project an intergenerational vision of Jewish life and learning, and I'll share that with you as well. Okay. Before I go there, and I'll ask Eric's help on this. I would like to, we're going to be talking about echoes. Undoubtedly, there were echoes at Sinai. No one heard God's voice purely and simply. There were human echoes and godly divine echoes. So I invite you to put in the chat, each person can put two if they choose. One good echo. What's a way in which echoes are a good thing? And secondly, bad echo. In what ways are echoes a bad thing? We'll give you a few minutes to drop those into the chat room, and then I'll ask Eric to share them, and then I'll share with you my view of good echoes of Revelation and bad, troublesome echoes. So, Eric, I'm on my in my presentation, but are we getting some drop-ins to the chat room?
Yeah, yeah. We've
Okay. Well, why don't we give them another minute and then you can read through them if you don't mind.
for sure.
And we'll archive and collect these and can get them to people if they have some interest in collecting echo thoughts about echoes. Okay, Eric, what do we got there?
All right. Well, they're still coming in, but I'll read you what I see here so far, which is Larry Pinsker wrote, the positive would be signs of life. The negative would be no one to talk to. Sharon Stiefel wrote, good echo, hearing more of good things you want to hear. Bad echo, hearing more of things that you don't want to hear. Um, our board member, Elizabeth Kaplan, wrote, positive, pearls of wisdom heard by chance. And Susan Singer has good echo, reaffirmation of positive thoughts. Mel, another important person on this call and a co-founder of the Kaplan Center, has the reality of hope. Um, Deborah Schein, who I think is related to you, Jeffrey.
Yes, it is.
Nature sounds are good echoes. Laughter is a good echo. And Elisheva, our director, interpretation of text in a no longer relevant manner would be, I guess, a negative echo. Deb has added a different one. Screams and sirens are bad echoes. And David Oler has inspiration to do mitzvah and feeling intimidated by external authority. Um, and somebody whose name here just appears as Pepkowitz, but
That's my old friend Sammy Pepkowitz. Yep.
okay, is a good echo. He writes, good echo, indeed, someone out there paying attention to what we emanate. Bad, the echo is totally incorrect in what we have said. And Elizabeth again adding echoes of violence from near and far. That's negative. Mel chiming in a negative one as well. The reality of despair. And Muriel Wasserman from RRC writing, good would be reverberations of wise words. Bad would be traumatic memories that hold on. So that's what
Well,
we
thank
got.
you. That is an impressive list. And I'm going to share with you a very good use of echo in my mind, and a very problematic use of the echo effect, which will lead us into our exploration of Kaplan and how I understand him to have understood Sinai. So here's the good use of an echo. We really need to hear the echo of the words and the sounds of the prayers we say. I think we live in a state of spiritual malnutrition because we spend so much time moving on to the next prayer that we haven't yet heard the echo of what that prayer means and how it touches our soul when we hear it a second or third time, or just let it sink in. We need that time, and we usually don't take it in life because we're in a rush, and in prayer because we're in a rush to get on to the next prayer. Now, what's a bad use of echo? I want to suggest that there's a string of commentators about human communication in the 20th and 21st century, and they build to a kind of crescendo that ends with the notion of an echo chamber. That there are other people on the list, but the four I'm most familiar with are Deborah Tanner, who wrote The Argument Culture. We'd rather argue than listen, back in 1998. I think I double checked that. William Bishop, who is the author of a very important book called The Big Sort, where he talks about the way for many of us when we were growing up. Certainly, it was the case for me in Eastgate Manor in Monroeville, Pennsylvania, that where I was living did not mean that I was living next to people who thought the way I did, that were Republican or Democratic or progressive. But by 2009, we began to live where people have the same view of the world. And he thought that was hugely problematic. Ezra Klein in 2020 gives that a special twist, saying that we politicize our conversations. And finally, Frank Bruni in 2024, in a book about um, the way in which we love to air our grievances. He calls it the air of grievance. That not only do we not hear other people very well, but we actually gain some perverse psychological values for ourselves by that process of feeling aggrieved that we're not being treated right in the world. Well, put those together and you have a phenomena defined by Webster that we've heard about. An echo chamber is an environment or ecosystem in which participants encounter beliefs that amplify or reinforce their pre-existing beliefs. In other words, we don't stretch to accommodate difference. We simply hear the echo of what we already believed. And when I finished my book, Lador Vidor in the Digital Age, um, my my moment of Matan Torah, my moment of revelation, was that while there are echo chambers of all sorts, political, cultural, economic, religious, I believe the most profoundly problematic echo chamber is the generational one, where we sort out and seek out people who have lived through our exact life experiences rather than hearing the life experiences of people at a different stage. So I will, near the end of this presentation, I will share with you um, a trio of resources that I'm working on to create not an echo, but a crescendo for moving forward with the Kaplanian vision. But now is the time to give you some additional context. I will be talking about selections from what we now call the art of being human, um, tr tr salvation as self-transcendence, as and a person who had a whole lot to do with that process. I'm going to take get out of the share mode is Dr. Eric Kaplan, who worked with this. Mel Scalt certainly had a role, and Richard Hirsch, who can't be with us, has played a primary role over the last 6 months. It's a very exciting volume, and I'm going to invite Eric to say a little more about it. So when I extract a particular idea in terms of my understanding of the beginning of Revelation, you'll have a better sense about that. So, Eric, I'm giving it back to you.
All right. So yeah, so I'm just gonna, briefly give some context uh, for this book. Um, so uh, the title itself is kind of gives away a lot of the story, right? The art of being human, salvation as self-transcendence. Only really the first part of the title is one that Kaplan himself uh, kicked around here and there. Um, he himself continued to kind of wonder about what titles would be. Those of you who have been through his diaries know that throughout the 50s, he was kicking around different potential titles for this book, never fully satisfied with what he had at any given moment. So, what is this book? So, in the diaries in 1951, you see that he writes that he has completed his book on soterics, which was um, which is a system of understanding salvation and how humans can achieve salvation. This is something that obviously salvation itself is a concept that is central to Kaplan's thinking, so that the opening chapter of Judaism as a civilization is a whole study of salvation as it was understood in the past and why we need to reinterpret that if Judaism is going to exist. Bottom line is he felt that religion has to help us get to the world that we all need, the better world, and that we today choose our affiliations and the things that we spend our time with an eye to how they contribute to our both personal betterment and to the betterment of others. If religion wasn't going to be an engine for that, then he thought that it wouldn't be able to continue to enjoy our allegiances in a world where we are pulled in so many other directions and where at least half of the Jewish people today live as a minority. And also, like I said, because he felt the world was at a crisis moment. Um, he was this was something that he spoke about a lot, but I think the evidence seems to be pretty strong that the rise of fascism in Europe, and then, of course, the events of World War II, and then the whole McCarthy project of the 1950s, really worried Kaplan, and nuclear The possibility of nuclear annihilation was a major concern of his as well. And within this context, it became very significant to him that religion help us get out of this situation, bring us to being better people, so that living better, so that we can do a better job at, at participating and contributing to this world. So his first shot at writing a book on, totally devoted to this question, was completed in 1951. He submitted it to Macmillan, and Macmillan rejected it. Basically, I won't go into all the reasons why, but he attempted at least one other time to submit it, and it was also rejected. The regular publishers were concerned about whether the audience could follow it, whether there would be an audience for it. But it just happened to be that he was invited to give a series of lectures in Hebrew in Israel, and he decided to devote them to issues related to the questions that he had put together in what we're calling the art of being human. And he reports in the diaries from Israel that, in fact, he gave these lectures the lectures that he had written. He wrote them in English, but then had them translated into Hebrew. He was pretty happy with the Hebrew translations, but a couple of things he thought the translator got wrong, and he writes that he retranslated small parts of it. And when Kaplan came back to the United States, within a year, the book of the lectures that he gave was published in Israel under the title Ha'emunah ve'Hamusar. Very few people are aware of this book because of the fact that it was published in Israel. It was published in Hebrew, even though it was written originally in English. And like we said, he didn't succeed in getting it published with a general publisher, which is what he wanted, because part of the uniqueness of this book is that it's really his only book in which Judaism is not the core material that he's dealing with. He quotes, yes, from the Hebrew Bible and from rabbinic texts, but he quotes very widely from a variety of psychologists and references other religions. He was trying to put forth a vision of the the things that a person has to do, and a society has to do to bring us to the desired space. And within that, the role that all religions, could play in it. So, as I'll just, don't want to take too much time, so I'll just quickly continue to tell you. So, as in many things Kaplan in our time, it was Mel Scalt who first had a copy of one of the English versions of the text, which he had gotten from one of Kaplan's daughters. And in one of the first meetings of the Kaplan Center board, he brought it to our attention. And Dan Cederbaum, who was our founder and president for our whole first many years, he thought that this could be worthwhile, and he hired Tzemach Yoreh to go into the RRC archives, take a look to see if there are other copies of this text in English or even in Hebrew. And then Tzemach found a number of different versions of it in the RRC archives, and working with the Hebrew and with all the different versions in the archives, he came up with kind of like a text that included all of the best material, that Kaplan had written, because Kaplan continued working on this throughout the 1950s and even into the early 1960s. And we then hired somebody, David Lopenstein, who's a book editor, to take a look at it. He really molded. Dan Cedarbaum started with him, but unfortunately passed away early on in the work that was happening with David. So I picked it up after Dan's very unfortunate passing, and worked with David a bit. And David wrote excellent commentary on the text. And David, I think, very succinctly, right at the beginning, pinpointed the challenge of this material, which is that a lot of it comes across in its original version as Kaplan trying to figure out what it is that he wants to say. So it is not like a completed manuscript that really fits together well and all the ideas are worked out. And as time went on, he kept on adding things to it, and not always integrating them smoothly into the text. The other thing that is a major challenge for this text is that he wanted very much, apparently, to show that his concern for the art of living, how to be the best human you can be, was not unique to him, but was part of 2,500 years of human experience of trying to figure out how to do this. And in order to illustrate that, he includes a lot of discussion of basically anything from, things in Christianity, things in psychology, things in philosophy, anything that he was aware of, Buddhism, Hinduism, going back, 2,500 years. And it makes for a very, very heavy and difficult to follow text where you often kind of lose sight of what the basic storyline is. Um, I approached Richard Hirsch, who I know some of you know, who's not only very, very knowledgeable of Mordecai Kaplan, but was the editor of the Reconstructionist magazine and is a very sensitive reader. And I asked him if he would work with me on trying to come up with a usable text. And Richard really did the majority of the work on getting it all to fit together. We both first read the text and then decided what should be included. But he really did the largest chunk of work in getting all of these segments that we had chosen and getting them to fit together. So the original text is about 240, 250 pages. Our version of it is only 82 pages. But it really is kind of, I think, a greatest hits of the book. I think that it gives the reader a keen sense of what are the essential points that Kaplan was trying to make. Some of these points will be familiar to those of you who are very familiar with Kaplan's work in the 1950s and 1960s and with the religion of ethical nationhood. Some of the things that he writes will echo there, but the framing of them and the emphasis on them as a whole and the way he puts it together is unique and something that is not in any of these in any of these other books. And just to show how important it continued to be to him, even after doing Religion of Ethical Nationhood, which has some of these themes in it, he, in the diaries, you can see that he continues to wonder what he could do with this material to get it more accessible. And in the interviews that Mel did with him, that Jane Susswine transcribed, this concept of addressing some of these issues that were part of the original Soterics manuscript are very, very strongly in his mind, and definitely something that he wants Mel to help him work with. I think at the moment the text is completed. We have finished the editing. We have sent it out to three academic presses, and we're waiting to see what happens. If they choose not to take it for whatever reason, we have other ways of publishing it. So this text will be available to you hopefully before the end of 2026. And I think that you will find it to be a special and unique text that adds something to the Kaplan corpus that you might be familiar with. And I think you'll get a taste of some of the things in the things that Jeffrey has highlighted for you. And I've got open on my computer some additional things that I could show you if towards the end of the webinar it becomes relevant. So I'm retreating now.
Okay, thank you, Eric. That's very helpful. Uh, my interest kept growing as different versions of the text came to me, and I was particularly taken with the notion of cosmic polarities that Eric and Richard tease out. And I'm interested in finding, as the beginning of the revelation process, some pure, simple hearing of the divine voice and what that might be like. So I am going to share with you um, a some of the a few of the ideas and where they come to for me. I note that there's a whole bunch of, and I hope to tease this out in the book, of approaches to teaching God that we might call Kaplanian in a broad sense. Here I use Wittgenstein's notions that there are family resemblances between ideas and you share a conceptual genetic code, even though you have differences. So I feel very fortunate that we have in among our people who present Kaplan and interpret Kaplan for children, people like Toba Spitzer, who works with And God is Here with metaphor, Sandy Sasso, whose work is metaphor, midrash, and godly play, and of course, Harold Kushner's classics, When Children Ask About God, Focus on Process, Godliness is When. And here I'm also indebted to Dr. Vered Sakol's very close reading of Kaplan through the lens of John Hick, the Protestant theologian, where she reclaims Kaplan as being an authentic theologian, even though he doesn't speak the formal languages of theology, and a realist. We usually think of Kaplan as a pragmatist, a subjectivist. It's you believe in God because it does good things for you. And I think both Dr. Sokol and Eric and Richard together and Mel give us a view that God is real and the reality of God in the universe is absolutely critical for the unfolding of our spiritual self. So I'm going to take you back to Sinai as I think a young child experiences it. And I'll show you one young child in just a minute. Um, this is my Deb and my grandson, Caleb, with his mother, Hannah, and his father, Greg. And they gave me an insight of how this notion that I find so rich in the New Kaplan manuscript plays itself out in the simplest way in a child's life. In a moment, we'll have a guest darshanit come here, who some of you will recognize, to tell the story of how Caleb brought this to our attention. I'm going to make it, I hope, a little easier for you to enter by saying that there are a couple people who offer some extraordinary insights for us that help understand what Caleb might be experiencing and what Kaplan means by cosmic polarities. One of them is um, the brilliant neuroscientist educator, Dr. Daniel Siegel, who, after studying children and development, says that, you know what, we need to talk about the experience of we, that people have a sense of both being their self and part of something larger. It's not me, it's not I, it's we. And there is a little known but very important psychologist, sociologist of the early 20th century named Andreas Angiel, who talked about the importance of understanding. He was both a biologist and a psychologist, and he said that we have twin urges from our very cellular level to our biggest conceptual level of what he calls autonomy. We're familiar with that, right? Being distinguished, a different part of the body, a different part of the organ, but equally homonymy, the urge to merge and be part. And they're in dynamic tension with one another. And we saw this, or I saw this in a different way when we were visiting Caleb a few years ago in Monterey, California.
I don't know if it's
Here,
showing.
speaker. Okay.
Okay. Some of you may have heard this before, but it's such a good story.
Are you seeing Deborah?
Can you hear?
I'm seeing you, Deb.
Okay.
Okay,
And
good.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we're sitting at a round table in Monterey, and Caleb is eating noodles. And he's eating them and he's slurping them. And his mom turns to him and says, Caleb, you're a noodle toodle. Toodle.
Yeah.
And Caleb is eating his noodles and he stops a minute and then he says, no, you're a noodle toodle, back to his mom. And then she says back to him, no, you're a noodle toodle. And then he looks at his grandfather, his Saba, and he says, Saba, you're a noodle toodle. And Jeffrey says, no, you're a noodle toodle. And then he looks at me and he says, Grandma, you're a noodle toodle. And I say, no, you're a noodle toodle. And his father says, no, you're a noodle toodle. And he stops, literally stops like that. And he looks at all of us and he throws his hands up like in the picture and he says, we're all noodle toodles. That's the story.
That's so my hypothesis is that Caleb has discovered the the experience that I find so resonant in this new volume. Eric may have other favorite passages, but I think the notion of cosmic polarities, where we are simultaneously something that's an end in ourselves and a means to other things in the world, i.e., connected to them, that combination is very rich and very important. And my favorite selection from my read of the volume at this point, though it may change, is I double checked this with Richard. Richard so artfully blends Kaplan's voice with his own and Eric's. I have a trouble disentangling him, but he said, this is Kaplan. So, Sof Pasuk, what's the end of the game? Once you've discovered cosmic polarities, what happens in your life? And Kaplan observes at one point, to achieve that purpose, people must relate to the ever widening and deepening synthesis of their selfhood and otherhood, the two aspects of that polarity that mark all existence and thought. Now, I mentioned echoes before. Would someone else be able to read that so we can hear the echo of the insight? Just unmute and read it back to us. Anyone?
Okay, now I'm going to jump in here. To achieve that purpose, people must relate to the ever widening and deepening synthesis of their selfhood and otherhood, the two aspects of that polarity that mark all existence and thought.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We're going to give you a
I
chance to,
have, can I read a passage uh, which I think echoes exactly what Jeffrey is saying?
please, Mel. How could
Yes,
we not? Go ahead.
what Kaplan said in this manuscript is that no one can be saved unless we all are saved. In other words, what comes across very, very strongly for me is Kaplan's universalism, particularly towards the end of the manuscript. Uh, and I think that's what you're saying, Jeffrey, about the polarity of selfhood and otherhood. He
I am trying to channel the understanding of Kaplan that comes out of the volume. So, yes, Mel, that is correct. And I am also very aware that Kaplan is an extraordinary educator. He cares about lifelong learning and lifelong moral development. Mel gave me earlier something that's at the center of our last contemporary Talmud, that the purpose of Torah is lifelong moral education. And would someone read? I am now just laying out the way in which that sense that Caleb has of otherness and selfhood, how Kaplan sees that changing and being transformed over time. So I actually hope Caleb, as a teenager or a college student, will have a chance to study Kaplan and find this an interesting mirror to himself. But I'm sure he'll go through this process. And could someone read the what's bolded here about once we become adolescents, something else needs to happen in this self and other relationship. Someone see it and read it for us, just the bolded parts.
I'll read it, Jeff.
Okay, thank you.
Everyone should be trained in the ability to assess feelings in oneself and in others. Without that ability, we cannot overcome the blocks that hamper communication or understanding.
And the seasons, they go round and round, and that adolescence has become an adult. And what does Kaplan see as the task of holding together the creative tensions between selfhood and we-ness when we become an adult? Would someone read what we have here as the next step in the journey?
I'll continue.
Please.
The emphasis in adult education should not be on technological and intellectual content, but on whatever has a bearing on human behavior and human destiny. The main concern should be how to keep remaking our character and improving our relations with one another.
Thank you, Don. Don's also a member of the Kaplan board. I'm glad that you're with us. So I don't have this finished. It's part of my work this summer and beyond to revisit and pull out other Kaplan passages and put them into a framework that amounts to lifelong character education, which is something Kaplan cared deeply about. But, and here my wife could echo this, it only works if we're sensitive to the earliest experiences of spirituality and the sense of self and other that were given to us in that vignette about Caleb and Noodle Toodles. There's other aspects here. I am very aware that the what I've just shared with you is reminiscent of the flow of verbs in the Ahava Rabbah prayer that precedes the Shema. Again, hear the echo of these important words. V'tein b'libenu, put in our hearts the ability lahavin lahaskil, to take in what's out there in the universe. Lishmoa l'lamed u'lmod, be able to share them with others. Lishmor v'lasot u'likayem, and turn them into active forces in our own life as we create our families and our communities. That's an extraordinary chain of verbs that need to be put together into a more comprehensive view. And I'm also very glad that on this very same call that we're having is my friend and colleague, Elizabeth Kaplan. Elizabeth and I at the Biyachad conference did a presentation about Kaplan and Musar and the places they come from. Kaplan comes from a Musar home. He translates a Musar classic. And yet, as I think Eric is well aware, when he begins to develop the resources for character education, he will go anywhere but to the traditional sources of what's leading to Musar and what he thought was a benighted, non-viable Orthodox community. He didn't know about the Vadim and the mindfulness and the things that are here. So Elizabeth and I are thinking about this. We're thinking about Josh Berdiger, a Reconstructionist rabbi, says that, renewal does some wonderful things and mindfulness does important things to us, but we have a tendency to jump into a kind of shlemut or cosmic unity. And what we first need to do, and I think Kaplan was very aware of this, is pay close attention to the experience of the other. I think those are in these texts here. And from there, we move forward where the Kaplan Center is thinking about doing a Kaplanian Musarvad next year. So stay tuned if you'd like to explore the confluence of Kaplanian insights with traditional Musar texts. It's very, I think, important and exciting. It also has a challenge in my mind of I got from Richard's last rendering of the introduction to the text that, the wonderful thing here is we have a kind of double helix is my word, double helix of spirituality and ethics. They belong together. They don't get muddled by peoplehood and culture. And yet, I think we try to sustain a triple helix of spirituality, ethics, and culture and civilization. So I'm very interested in the way they blend together and see that as an exciting part of what I'd like to explore in the book. I always try to be good to my word about leaving time for question and comment. So I just want to go for a minute now to the last section of the book, where if the beginning is what's Sinai like? What moments of educational revelation can we savor and work with? Well, how do we take those in the world to make it a better world and make the Jewish people stronger? So I see a confluence and an analysis of three texts threaded through one another. One is, I think there's some educators on the call with us, They are certainly aware of this quote from Kaplan's chapter on Jewish education. It is necessary to change radically the very notion of what constitutes the educational process. As Jews, if we will solely rely upon the Jewish school to achieve these aims, they are bound to fail. Hence, Kaplan's love of community, of camp, as places that create environments that this can happen. And Kaplan didn't know this guy, but I'm going to help Kaplan encounter him, I hope, and Ivan Illich encounter Mordecai Kaplan. Ivan Illich is a priest scholar, a radical liberation theologian who is a critic of education and its need to credential everything. He gave me the insight. It was so small and yet so important that the capitalist economy means that we all have to buy something. So in my little block in Shaker Heights, everyone had their own lawnmower. Well, isn't that stupid? Who needs a lawnmower that sits idle 99% of the time? We need to create tools that people can use. And I am really indebted to one of the heroes of my book, Lador Vador in the Digital Age, a gentleman called Greg Parks, who is the youth director educator at Temple Solel and Ensenadas. He knows Kaplan. He ends his chapter, I am reminded of the best definition of holiness I have ever seen. It's Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who wrote, Holiness exists when power and goodness coexist in perfect harmony. When the different generations are connected, I am convinced we live in a holier fashion. And the backstory is that this educator who's attended national conferences and presented all the successes of youth education at Temple Solel in Ensenadas, California, notes around 2010 that something has changed profoundly. He used to go to the youth lounge and he would find it buzzing with activity, with people talking. Now he goes to the youth lounge and he can hear a pin drop. Why? Well, you know why? Because people are on their phones. They're having those kinds of conversations. So he does this incredible breaking of the vessels of traditional education, draws what he calls a kibbutz model, and begins to join across the generations people who have common and deep commitments to the environment, to justice, to weaving and the arts. And what comes out of this is a non-echo chamber, an intergenerational form of learning that he finds to be very, very rich and important. And I do too. And I think it's in keeping with the spirit of how I understand Kaplan and how I'd like to interpret him, along with all the concrete examples of working in a Kaplanian mode, going beyond that to be broad, prophetic, and interpretive. So you can wish me luck with that. And before we will have time to um, go back to the text that I shared earlier, give you a chance, we're doing well on time, give you a chance to look at it, slow down, hear an echo in your own mind or from another person. But before we do that, I want to turn back to Eric to see if he had comments or if there have been questions placed in the chat room about this presentation of a Kaplanian view of Sinai, where it all begins and where it might go to as it unfolds over the life cycle.
Yeah, I don't have any questions at this point, and there isn't anything in the chat so far. Larry Pinsker asked a very specific question about what came before one of the texts that you included from the Art of Being Human book. So I looked at my copy of it and I pasted it as much of it that would fit into the chat because I learned there's a limit of 1,000 characters when you're pasting in the chat, which I never knew. But other than that, the chat so far has been pretty quiet.
Okay, so Larry, you want to give us nice to see you? What's your question or observation?
Should I type it into the chat or would you like me to just say it?
I think at this point you could just say it.
I thank you for the wonderful presentation and the sparks it's generated and the echoes are amazing. I'm going to start with what may not be as simple as I think it is, but in your homage to John Venn, the philosopher and logician who invented the Venn diagram, I was struck by the intersections with Kaplan and grandly absent were the sciences. And I was struck by the contrast between the use of the word cosmic and as a part of metaphorical language, when I really want us to talk about Kaplan's the influences of science on Kaplan and why we don't see that the dialogues that we have and the narratives we have and the prayers we can say with integrity all have an issue with the sciences. And I'm not talking about what in grade 8 everybody outgrows about, oh, it didn't really happen in 7 days. And, there was a big bang. That's truly kid stuff. I'm talking about what cosmologists and quantum physicists and others in the sciences are doing that reflects theological metaphors and is flipping the pages of the way in which the science community is beginning to talk in language that I think of as holy. And I find that I dearly want Kaplan to be more than an early 20th century or late 19th century scientist wrestling on behalf of Darwin. I really want him to champion ideas about the distribution of consciousness throughout the universe that are emerging from cosmology now. Nobody is talking about Kaplan as a mythopoetic author. No one is celebrating his mythogenesis, his licensing everybody to be your own myth maker. And I find that your work, and especially your most recent work, is replete with that celebration of human creativity, and it isn't seeping into synagogue life. Did I say too much, Jeff?
No, but what you're saying, Larry, leads to an invitation for you to write about that. I'm sure we can share that, through the Kaplan Center. I think it's on target and important, and would like to hear more about it. So perhaps I or perhaps Elisheva can be back in touch with you. Um, I do see, and we have a tradition now of the contemporary Talmud where we take a piece of Kaplan. The last was the Torah is lifelong moral education. I can see taking the very notion of cosmic polarities or one of the other choice texts, putting it in the center and inviting people such as yourself to be the metargamim, the translators and interpreters of how they understand that section. So thank you for the idea, I think is
If
what
I
I
can
want to
just
say.
chime in here, I would, before I turn to Mel, who's indicated that he'd like to say something too, which is that what Kaplan tries to do with the concept of cosmic polarity, right? He's trying to move us beyond the idea that our sense of what is good and bad is subjective in some way. right? He's trying to find a way of showing that our sense of the good and the bad kind of transcend this particular moment and transcend our, personal inclinations. And that's what cosmic polarity is all about, because it starts off with his bold assertion that everything in the universe exists in a polarity of focus on self-development and focus on interacting with others. And he believes everything on Earth and that transcends Earth that we are aware of exists in this polarity of developing the self and developing the relationship with with others. And then further on the question of science, right? There's a quote towards the end of the book where he basically says that turning to the variety of social sciences. He talks about anthropology and other science and social sciences, and he basically says that in our schools, and he's meaning in our elementary and our high schools, we should be focused on teaching more of these disciplines because of and we should be looking at what we learn from educational research. So again, scientifically conducted research in order to understand people better and to understand how we move people from point A to point B. And that doing so is more important than some of the advanced mathematics that we spend so much of our time teaching. So I think that there is like a it's not just a metaphor, cosmic polarity. He thinks that it represents something that is scientific, and he shows in the book his interest, his continuing interest in psychology, anthropology, philosophy, anything and the study of education, anything that can help us along in that regard. But I don't know, Jeffrey, if you want to put a point up here before I turn to Mel.
I do, and then I want to call on the other Schein whose hand's up, and will have something to say. Lishmor lasot l'kayem, from Ahava Rabbah, that the point of it all, and Kaplan's very clear about this, is not education lishma, as value as that might be, but to make a better world. And here, one of my favorite quotes, though it's rather dense, and is even denser when I turn to Vered Sacco for her take on this, um, when she collides Kaplan up against John Hicks and says they're both realist philosophers in the sense that there's a reality to the Godhead. It's not just a means to an end. So here it is. Therefore, simultaneously with our reaching for high goals, we must cultivate faith not only in ourselves and in our communities, but in the cosmic character of that which can bring authentic personality and community into being. And I love this particular next sentence. The drive or impulsion of any organic unit to function both as a means and ends to the maximal potential inherent in it. The drive or impulsion is godhood or divinity as an objective reality, for it is a manifestation of the universal polarity of individuation and interaction, which, and I love this, I don't know, Eric, if you or Richard or Mordecai came up with this, which gives rise to motion, life, and mind. I just thought that was pretty rich.
Well,
I think Deb and Mel are both looking to make comments. So, Deb, do you want to start? And then
Yeah,
Mel, we'll
yeah.
hear from
Well, Larry, as always, I'm listening to you and thinking, do I really understand you? But I'm not sure, but I'm going to comment anyway. So I have gotten very interested in quantum theory. And don't ask me how that happened because it's a long story, but I am just so interested in it. And has to do with my understand of spirituality and energy from the infant to the universe and the universe back. So it's cosmic flow in that way. It's my image of godliness, that energy that emanates from within and external from us. So when you talk about science, I think it's for me the unknown knowing that is starting to happen, because I find articles on quantum theory and quantum education and quantum energy almost weekly. So that's really happening. And then Jeff, as you talk about cosmic energy from the story of Caleb, I see that energy between, the I thou kind of
Mm.
energy flow. It's exciting.
Thanks, Deb. Mel, I think we're dual moderating here, Eric. Can we call on Mel?
Well, I'd just like to add a number of footnotes to what people have been saying. Um, when Kaplan discovered Heschel, um, what entranced him was the fact that Heschel talked about piety as an objective quality. This is what Eric was saying before, and this is really the challenge of the polarities. In other words, Kaplan used the concept which he borrowed from Hermann Cohen, uh, the great philosopher, Kantian, early in the century, of correlative. What he meant by correlative was the one element implies another. In other words, the donut implies the whole. Parent implies the child. And what Kaplan said is that the human being and God are correlative. And I think that's really the primary thrust of what you're saying, Jeffrey, in talking about the polarities. In other words, when we focus on the matter of hope within the human being, that is an element of the divine which the universe supports. Kaplan liked to talk about the support of the universe for those elements within us, whereby we can work towards perfection. Because at the beginning of the diary, as you remember, he was speaking to Harvard, and he says that the primary purpose of religion is the perfection of the individual, and that must exist within the community. And so, anyway, I'll leave with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. So many rich insights. I do want to return to those several texts for those people who can stay on. We understand if you can't, but to make comment, to give you a chance to dig into a few words or idea. But while we have a nice full set of 30 some folks on board, I want to invite our executive director, Rabbi Elisheva Salamo, to say a few words about another webinar that's coming up in about 3 weeks. So I don't want you to miss that invitation. So,
Oh,
Elisheva?
thank you. Sorry, I've been having a lot of tech troubles. So thank you very much. Actually, I think what I'd love to do, first of all, is say thank you so much, Jeffrey. I also don't have a voice. And for your insight and your expansion of our minds into new places, and your absolute dogged re-envisioning of Kaplan's role and influence in our future and Caleb's future. And I also really want to thank Ben Stein for sponsoring this webinar. Such important thing to have our listeners be part of our support community. It means a lot to us to have those opportunities. I will actually give you a little tiny thought about next year. We're going to be choosing 8 of our rabbis from all different stages and from all different locations in their rabbinates, and we're going to be having wonderful conversations with them. So you will get a program of that sometime in the middle of the summer. But I will turn it back over to you, Reb Jeff, to take us deeper and farther into your text.
Well, I again, I believe in the value of the echo of our ideas. So I'm just going to go to the text that were attached and just give people a chance to look at it, to hear it one more time, and to comment if there's a word or idea here that you feel is important or problematic. We may need to challenge it to get its maximum meaning. So I interpreted Sof Pasuk, the end game, to achieve that purpose, people must relate to the ever widening and deepening synthesis, their selfhood and otherhood, the two aspects of that polarity that mark all existence and thought. Is there a word or a phrase here that you want to underscore or question in terms of getting the most out of this new volume that's coming forward? You can, at this point, I think you can just unmute yourself and tell us what you're looking at. What's the idea you're questioning or underscoring?
So for me, this is another way of talking about widening the tent and welcoming people that may or may not be actually all toodle. What was Caleb's phrase?
Noodle toodles.
Noodle toodle. And I
Yeah.
think, Jeff, you told me that story about Caleb a few months ago as we were starting to work together. And it has been echoing in my head actually since then. And
You're
so,
only 180 miles from him. You can go
yeah,
visit
I
him
know I
and
could go and,
interview him.
talk with him directly. So more power to Caleb here. And what I think I came up with is this idea of, in the child's life, suddenly realizing that there is a whole world out there that is a part of, right? That we all noodle toodles is so incredibly important. And incredibly important is the next step, is to realize that, wait a minute, not all good people are noodle toodles. And I need to make a relationship with those people who maybe are gluten intolerant and don't like spaghetti or whatever. And I think this is for me, this is the lesson, right? Sometimes and that's the echo chamber that we live in. We only want to live in with people that are noodle toodles. And that can become a pitfall.
Other thoughts?
Hey, Jeff, can I
Hello.
just
Hi, hello. Nice to
just
see
a
you. This
suggestion
is
that reading your end game, what really is in mind is shlemut, the whole person, and achieving wholeness in life. It seems to me that the synthesis he's talking about is really what we think of Judaically as shlemut.
Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth and I have talked about that and find Shlemut an important bridge between Musar and its goals and Kaplan and what he was aiming for. So I think you're right on that Shlemut is something that involves the individual and the relationships to the world and to the Jewish people. It's a very rich, complex notion to experience shlemut.
If I could just add a footnote. Uh, Kaplan was looking for an English for a Hebrew equivalent of salvation in the 1950s, and he discovered in the Musaf of the Regalim, where it says about God, Ata Shalom v'Shimcha Shalom, that you are peace and your name is peace. So that peace is the essence of the divine, and that's the collective, and the individual is shlemut, which is derived from shalom. So anyway, I discovered that many, many years ago, and so I've been advocating, and I think it's catching on, Rabbi Cohn. Uh, the idea of shlemut, if we can push that, because it was uh, perhaps, easier for people than salvation.
And shlemut really would be godliness.
Well, I prefer perfection. In other words,
Okay,
we
yeah.
need to
Well,
move constantly up on the ladder of the midot, the extra 5%. I think, that's really, to me, what religion is about and what Kaplan was about.
I would add that shlemut, shalom, it's also the same root as leshalem, to pay. So at the most pedestrian level, shlemut is the first steps to shlemut is to recognize what you owe to others and honor that.
Right. I've been thinking as well that the way in which people like Buber or Levinas sensitize us from the get-go to the reality of the other and the ethical demands that the other has on us is also there in Buber, but in Kaplan, but the language needs to be um, refined because I do think the Shlemut we're searching for. I mean, I think it's infinitely and richly complex. It has to do with ourselves, our communities, and this I get from Eric's entry into our contemporary Talmud, where we talk about what does it mean to to think of all the whole purpose of Torah is moral education. Eric and I have also tried to do this, love the way in which Kaplan insists that that's not self-congratulating. That's stepping back and using that moral microscope to look at your communities and your structures and to see what imperfections are there so that you can move it, closer to Shlemut. It's really very, challenging, I think, in a good way.
If I might suggest, Jeffrey, you kind of put what you're reading, what I put in the chat box, or you could.
Please, David.
If I might suggest, perhaps going back to the term self-transcendence, that Shlemut really involves self-transcendence, moving beyond the ego.
Well, Eric, you're still there. Why did you and Richard in the end? I think I weighed in perhaps negatively on this, but why did you in the end want to, after the colon of the art of being human, focus um, on salvation as self-transcendence? Why was that important? Do you think there are people around who think salvation is a totally inner self-centered process, and you want Kaplan to be a corrective or a counterweight to that? Um, we could have had this conversation another way, but I'm glad to have it publicly. Well, I know you once said it ticked off all the boxes in terms of of a selling title, but why were you so focused on salvation as self-transcendence?
Eric, I'm gonna throw in a question similar to Jeffrey's, which is when we change metaphors, we start a new dance. And what I'm hearing is that the concept of self-transcendence incorporates a highly powerful sense, highly powered sense of self as being the center of the transaction. My whole sense of what happens when we insist on mindfulness is that we're paying, as Elizabeth noted, we're paying attention. And paying attention diminishes your sense of yourself in order to be able to make the bridge to the other, so that the other doesn't become part of your echo that you want to hear of your own voice. It's When Mel was focusing on Shlemut, I thought he was about to give us the logical outcome of that, which is Shlemut is wholeness. We used to talk about that in the 70s and 80s. But now we have a sense of wholeness being involved in diminishing the ego. And we don't know how to do that anymore. It used to be a big part of shtetl culture, and I speak from my own father's non-academic perspective of that growing up in a shtetl in Eastern Europe, that the culture reminded people, you're not alone, you're not in this for yourself alone, and bring the chicken soup to the other person, because that is giving up of yourself for the sake of the enhancement of your consciousness that you get from relating to that person. It's why you and Debbie love each other, Jeff. It's why people connect in that way. There's transcendence, but it doesn't focus so much on self in isolation.
I'm going to ask my good friend Jeff Eisenstadt to comment on kids come to camp, right? Do they come with a greater sense of self or community? And how did Camp Havaya um, develop their sense of Shlemut? How did you think of Shlemut, and what were the challenges of Shlemut in a camp
Yeah,
environment?
so that's really good, Jeff. And I felt what was missing from all of this was the concept of kehillah, that building a holy community is really essential in trying to establish this kind of experience, bringing kids together. But in a world today with such polarity, I think that the transcendence now, if if you don't care for what someone else is saying, whether it's in Monroeville or in Philadelphia, then you divorce yourself from them, and I think we're missing what the whole concept of peoplehood and what the spiritual peoplehood in Kaplanian version was all about, and creating at camp, we wanted to find a Kehila Kadosha where kids and adults and communities could share in understanding of the values, the midot that they wanted to share. If you don't have that, I think you're really missing something.
Okay. Other comments as we approach the end of our hour and a half together, which I felt have found it very stimulating and enjoy the challenges and the questions. Any ending comments that anyone would like to make?
I would just like to say it's been a while since I've been on a seminar, and it's nice to see everybody.
Oh, there's Karen. Hi. Yeah. Well,
Yeah, can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah. Do you have a
Yeah,
sure?
yeah. I kind of put my comment in the chat, but my favorite part, of course, was Deb's story. It was all wonderful and very academic, and a lot of new ideas for me to grapple with. But just just the sense of wonder in children and what they contribute. And my brother has some grandchildren now that live in Pittsburgh near me, and just being around them as little 2 and 3 year olds, and it's we should never forget that and where it can take us. It can take us to a very high level conversation.
Yeah,
It's the starting point. I love it. So thank you.
for sure. Thanks for
Yeah.
the reminder.
I just want to on the comments that were made and the question that you had for us for me before you turned to Jeffrey, which is that we came up with the 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 challenge of the title was to come up with something that is in the neighborhood of what Kaplan himself contemplated as one of the titles of the book. And to do the book justice, in other words, to get at, to reflect a core point that he is making in the book that really runs through it, um, and that doesn't duplicate the titles that have been written by other people, hundreds and hundreds of books that have the same kind of title. So that's really what we were getting at. So the art of being human relates directly to the title that Kaplan himself entertained for this book. It connects to the idea that his whole paradigm of the four things, as you'll see when you hold the book, the four areas that need to be worked on in a big way. Relate to Aristotle's conception of the four things that are involved in the creation of a piece of art, right? And that's how we get to that. And salvation is self-transcendence is because that is the core theme of the book. But in terms of the role of community in the whole in the whole picture, I just wanted to point out some of the subchapter titles, right, that you haven't seen yet. So in chapter 5, right, so the first part is human person as ultimate purpose, but the second part is the community as purpose. In the final section of the book, chapter 7, the dimension of intelligence, the second part of it is religious fellowship as an instrument of character building. So Kaplan is definitely aware, as we all know, of the significance of community generally into his thought. But the book definitely considers the role of community in the development of character.
Yeah, one of the things that amazed Elizabeth and I as we explored Musar and Kaplan is that character and building characters at the core of both enterprises, but they do it in very different ways. As Eric is aware, when Kaplan thinks about psychology and all the insights and character education, it's going to come from that cutting edge of new psychology. And I'm amazed that the person who translated Misilat Yesharim, Lusato's Path of the Righteous, thinks that the way to develop character is certainly there are Jewish resources, but he's really, and Mel has said this, Mel had to, Ein Kemach Ein Torah, he forgot to eat, he has to go eat, that's a good thing. But Mel said that Kaplan thought that in certain sense, people like Eric Fromm were going to lead the way to the sense of salvation that we could experience, or the development of character. I think it's much more nuanced. And as I read through the selections, was aware that Kaplan was aware that for teenagers, for instance, you have to really work hard on getting them to see the other. It's a period where it's eclipsed in their life because there's so much going on internally. But the work of character education is to help them. I just thought that was a very powerful statement to look at the other and view the world through that prism as well. So listen, you folks have two good things to look forward to. The coming out of this volume when it gets published, The Art of Being Human. Um, uh, Salvation as self-transcendence, and a fuller 21st century set of resources for doing the work of Kaplan with our children and communities and our synagogues, and all important work. So thank you. This has been a very valuable platform for me to share the Adkan. Up to here, this is the way I've been thinking about it, and preparing for this webinar was the first time I outlined what I think will be in the volume. It will be a digital volume to maximize resources, but you gave me that opportunity. So everyone, take care. Continue your journey towards Sinai, and have a good rest of the Omer period, and a Hag Sameach as Shavuot approaches.
And
Thank
thank
you,
you,
Okay.
everybody.
Jeffrey.
Hello,
Thanks.
Harriet Feiner.
There.
So nice to see so
Bye,
many people.
everyone.
Bye, everyone, and
I've
thank
been
you so
listening.
much. Jeff, that was great. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, Harriet.
Thanks for that performance,
Bye.
Deb.